The mockery. The Galactic Summit was the most important event in the universe. Leaders from hundreds of alien empires gathered in the Grand Hall of Zephyr Prime, the capital of the Zephyrian Empire. It was a place where wars ended, alliances were formed, and decisions shaped the future of the galaxy. At the center of the massive hall, under the golden glow of floating lights, sat the Zephyrian High Chancellor Varax. He was tall and strong, his reptilian scales shining in the light. His 4 eyes scanned the room with arrogance. The Zephyrian Empire was the most powerful force in the galaxy, and today they had one goal: to put humanity in its place. A Zephyrian officer stepped forward and announced in a loud voice, presenting the representative of the Terran Union, Ambassador Evelyn Drake. The grand doors opened. A single human woman walked inside. The room fell silent for a moment. Then someone laughed. It started with a quiet chuckle from one of the smaller alien species. Then, a deep rumbling laugh from the hulking warlords of the Draxel Dominion. Soon, the entire chamber was filled with mocking laughter. Even Varax smiled, shaking his head. "This is a joke." Evelyn Drake kept walking. She was old, at least by human standards. Her silver hair was tied neatly behind her head, and she wore a simple black diplomatic coat. She moved with calm confidence, her sharp blue eyes scanning the hall as if she had seen it all before. A Zephyrian official stepped forward, smirking. "Is this it? The mighty Terran Union sends an old woman to speak for them." Evelyn reached the center of the hall and stopped. She did not react. Varax leaned forward on his golden throne. "I expected a warrior, a scientist, a leader. But this is an insult." The room erupted in laughter once again. Even the more diplomatic alien races chuckled. The Terran Union had been growing in power, but sending an old diplomat instead of a military leader, that was weakness. A young Zephyrian warrior sneered. Maybe she got lost on her way to the retirement home. Evelyn smiled. Not a nervous smile, not an embarrassed one. It was the smile of someone who knew a secret. She finally spoke, her voice calm and smooth. "I expected better from the mighty Zephyrian Empire, but I suppose rumors of your intelligence were exaggerated." The laughter stopped instantly. Varax's eyes narrowed. "Careful, human. You are in our house." Evelyn tilted her head slightly. "Am I?" The room grew tense. For the first time, some of the alien delegates looked nervous. Then, a whisper. It came from a Silithian diplomat, a member of an ancient species known for their wisdom. His skin turned pale as he stared at Evelyn, his voice shaking. "Wait, that's Evelyn Drake." The Zephyrian warrior frowned. "So what?" The Silithian diplomat swallowed hard. "You don't know who she is." Murmurs spread through the crowd. Some of the older alien leaders froze in shock. A Krogan warlord leaned forward, his voice low. "The Butcher of Xiron 5. A Zalnari admiral whispered, "The ghost of the Titan War." Another alien muttered, "She's the one who destroyed the Krallis Dominion in a single night." A new kind of silence filled the hall. The younger Zephyrian warriors looked confused, but the older officials, the ones who had been in power for a long time, looked pale. Varax scoffed. "Stories. Legends. I see an old woman, not a warrior." Evelyn stepped forward and placed her hands on the table. Her voice remained calm. "Chancellor Varax, I did not come here to prove myself. I came here to offer you a choice." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small black cube. She set it down gently. "This contains a message from the Terran Union High Command. I suggest you listen to it carefully." Varax narrowed his eyes but motioned for an officer to pick it up. The officer touched the cube, and instantly, a hologram appeared above the table. A deep metallic voice spoke. "To the leaders of the Zephyrian Empire, this is your final warning. Submit to diplomatic negotiations or face the consequences. If you refuse, we will act. And you already know what happens when humanity is forced to act." The message ended. The room was dead silent. Varrax growled. "Threats?" Evelyn smiled again. "I never threaten, Chancellor. I make promises." Some of the alien leaders shifted in their seats. They had seen what happened to civilizations that underestimated humans. Varrax clenched his fists. "You expect us to surrender? To a species as young as yours?" Evelyn leaned forward, her voice almost a whisper. "Your empire mocks humans. That's your mistake." She turned to leave. As she walked away, a Zypharian officer ran into the room, panting and pale. He whispered something in Varrax's ear. The Chancellor's face changed, his arrogance vanished. His eyes widened in fear. Something had happened. Something terrible. Evelyn Drake smiled to herself as she walked through the grand doors. The game had begun. The whispered name. The silence in the grand chamber of the Galactic Summit was unnatural. A few minutes ago, the room was filled with mocking laughter. Now, it was filled with something far more dangerous. Fear. The mighty Chancellor Varrax, ruler of the Zypharian Empire, sat frozen on his golden throne. His 4 reptilian eyes stared at the terrified officer who had just whispered something in his ear. His claws tightened around the armrests, cracking the polished stone. His tail lashed against the floor in irritation, but behind his anger, there was something else. Uncertainty. Evelyn Drake, the old human woman he had mocked moments ago, watched him closely. Her face remained calm, but her sharp blue eyes saw everything. The chamber was no longer just a meeting hall. It had become a battlefield, a war of words, a war of power, a war of fear. Varrax finally spoke, his voice lower, measured. "Say that again." The Zypharian officer gulped. His scales were a shade lighter now, a clear sign of distress among his species. He hesitated before repeating himself. "Sir, the border outposts at Morska 7 and Talon Prime are gone." A murmur spread through the alien delegates. Varrax's claws scratched against the stone. "Explain." The officer took a deep breath. An unknown force wiped them out, completely. No distress signal, no survivors, no debris. Just gone. Varrax's tail stilled. No survivors, no debris. That meant only one thing. Humanity had sent the Revenant Protocol. A deadly silence spread through the chamber. Some of the alien leaders shifted uncomfortably, while others looked horrified. A Draxul warlord, a massive being covered in dark red armor plates, leaned forward. His voice was a deep rumble. "The Revenant Protocol." He turned his piercing gaze to Evelyn. "You actually used it." Evelyn sighed, as if she were explaining something simple to a child. "You should know by now. We don't bluff." The whispering voices grew louder. One alien delegate, a fragile-looking Silithian, turned pale. His long fingers trembled as he reached for his glass of water. He barely managed to hold it. "The Revenant Protocol was just a myth," he whispered. Evelyn turned to look at him. "Then why are you shaking?" The Silithian flinched. He knew the stories. Everyone did. The last time, the Terran Union activated the Revenant Protocol, an entire empire disappeared in a single night. Not conquered, not occupied, not even destroyed in battle. Just erased. Varrax bared his fangs, but his voice was quieter now, like he was testing the waters. "This is not possible. Our fleets would have stopped your attack." Evelyn smiled. Not a friendly smile, not a mocking one. A predator's smile. "You still don't understand, Chancellor." She took a step forward. "Your fleets never saw us coming." The Draxul warlord let out a low growl. "That means," he turned his gaze toward the Zypharian Chancellor, "your defense systems failed." Varrax's eyes flashed with rage, but he remained seated. He knew the warlord was right. The Zypharian Empire had always believed it was invincible. Its fleets controlled the largest sectors of the galaxy. Its warriors were brutal and fearless. No species dared to challenge them. Yet, in the span of a single hour, their mighty border defenses had vanished, and not even a single distress call had escaped. Evelyn let the silence stretch before she spoke again. "There's something you should know about humans, Chancellor." She picked up the small black cube from the table and held it between her fingers. "We were never the strongest. We were never the smartest. We weren't born into the stars like your kind." She took a slow step forward. "But do you know what we are?" Rax did not answer. Evelyn's smile grew colder. "We are survivors." A chill ran through the chamber. The alien leaders had heard the stories. Humanity had been invaded, oppressed, nearly wiped out in its early years. But every time, the invaders disappeared. No one knew how. No one ever found the bodies. Evelyn turned the cube in her hand. "The reason you don't hear about wars with humanity," her voice dropped into a whisper, "is because we don't leave survivors to tell the tale." The Zypharian officer stumbled back. He was clearly too young to remember the last war with humanity. But the older aliens, they remembered, and they were afraid. Varrax's breathing deepened. He tried to look strong, but Evelyn could see the doubt in his eyes. For the first time in his life, he was facing an enemy he did not understand. A shadow passed over his face. "I don't believe in ghosts." His voice was quieter now. Evelyn chuckled. "You don't have to." She placed the cube back on the table. "It won't change the fact that you're already haunted." The chamber remained silent as Evelyn turned and walked away. She had one last message before she left. "Chancellor, you have two choices." She reached the door and stopped, turning her head slightly. "You can negotiate peace." She smiled, but there was no warmth in her expression. "Or you can find out what happens when humanity decides to erase your name from history." Then she walked out of the chamber. Behind her, the most powerful empire in the galaxy had just realized it was already too late. The ultimatum. A storm was brewing in the Zypharian Grand War Chamber. Chancellor Varrax sat at the head of a massive obsidian table, his claws tapping against the polished stone. His 4 reptilian eyes flickered between his advisors, each one looking more uneasy than the last. The room was dim, lit only by floating holoscreens displaying battle reports. None of them were good news. Evelyn Drake, the human diplomat, had walked out of the Galactic Summit just hours ago, but the impact of her words was still crushing the Empire like a slow-moving avalanche. The border outposts at Morska 7 and Talon Prime were gone. No distress calls, no wreckage, just erased from existence. Varrax's tail flicked sharply. "I want answers." His military commanders looked at one another nervously. A deep, growling voice spoke first. It belonged to General Orvek, a veteran of the Titan War. His scales were a deep crimson, his fangs worn from years of battle. But even he looked unnerved. "Chancellor, we still do not know how the humans did it." His voice was measured, careful. There was no energy signature, no ship detected on sensors. Our fleets were in position. The outposts should have seen them coming. Varrax's eyes narrowed. "Then explain why they didn't." The general hesitated before answering. His throat tightened. "Because there was nothing to see." The word sent a chill through the chamber. Varrax clenched his jaw. "Impossible." Another advisor, a pale-skinned strategist named Krallis, spoke next. "Not impossible, Chancellor, just terrifying." He tapped on his console, pulling up a holographic projection. The screen displayed a fleet formation, 3 Zypharian warships stationed at Talon Prime. It showed the outpost scanners, watching empty space. Then, without warning, every signal flickered off. Not jammed, not disrupted, just gone. Krallis's voice trembled. It's as if something turned off reality itself for a split second. The chamber fell silent. Varrax's claws dug into the table. He was not a coward. His empire had conquered dozens of civilizations. He had crushed rebellions, burned planets, ended wars. But this This was something new. Are you telling me that humans have developed invisible weapons? General Orvek shook his head. No, Chancellor. He tapped the console. The screen changed again, showing a list of destroyed civilizations. The Krallis Dominion, the Axiron Empire, the Virex Coalition. Every single one had mocked humanity. Every single one had disappeared. Orvek's voice was barely a whisper. I'm telling you, the humans have been using them for centuries. A name that echoes in fear. Varrax felt his throat go dry. He had dismissed the old war stories, tales of Evelyn Drake, the butcher of Tyron 5. He had thought they were exaggerations. Now he wasn't so sure. An old, frail voice spoke next. High Priest Selar, the spiritual leader of the Zypharian Empire. His kind rarely left their temples, but tonight, even he had come. The aged Zypharian lifted his head, his pale golden eyes clouded with something ancient and tired. I was there when the Krallis Dominion mocked the humans, he murmured. The room stilled. The younger Zypharians leaned in, listening. Phalar continued, his voice slow and haunted. The Krallis were mighty. Their fleets numbered in the thousands. They ruled their part of the galaxy for over 2 millennia. He exhaled. And then they insulted Evelyn Drake. A heavy silence pressed down on the war chamber. The older Zypharians already knew the story. The younger ones were hearing it for the first time. Varrax remained silent. He had always thought the Krallis fell to infighting. But now, Zaler's next words chilled him to his core. They disappeared, not defeated, not enslaved, not even a single survivor. He stared directly at Varrax. Now tell me, Chancellor, do you still think this is a coincidence? The ultimatum arrives. Before Varrax could answer, an alarm blared. A Zypharian officer ran into the room, his chest heaving. His golden uniform was drenched in sweat. See, Chancellor. His voice cracked. Varrax snapped his attention to him. Speak. The officer gulped, then pulled up a hologram transmission. It was a live feed from the Zypharian Border Command Center, and it showed something horrifying. The human fleet was already here, not weeks away, not even days away. They had somehow bypassed every defense line and appeared right outside Zypharian space. Massive, sleek warships, dark, angular, and silent. No energy signals, no communication, just waiting. Then, a single transmission came through. The screen flickered, and Evelyn Drake appeared. Her face was calm, her blue eyes unreadable. She held up a small black cube, the same one she had placed on the Galactic Summit table. Then she spoke. Your time is up. The room froze. Chancellor Varrax, she continued, her voice smooth as steel. You mocked humanity. You underestimated us. You thought we were weak. She leaned forward. You were wrong. The Zypharian generals shifted uncomfortably. Some looked at Varrax, waiting for him to give the order to fight. But Varrax said nothing. Evelyn's voice turned cold. You have 1 hour to surrender. She placed the cube on her desk and folded her hands. If you don't, she smiled, you will learn why the galaxy still whispers my name. Then the transmission cut off. The Zypharian war chamber sat in absolute silence, and for the first time in his life, Chancellor Varrax had no idea what to do. The first strike. The war chamber falls silent. Time seemed to freeze inside the Zypharian war chamber. Chancellor Varrax sat motionless, his 4 reptilian eyes locked on the blank holoscreen, where Evelyn Drake's transmission had just ended. Her words still echoed in the chamber. You have 1 hour to surrender. The Zypharian Empire, the most feared force in the galaxy, had been given an ultimatum by a single human. A human who never bluffed. A human whose name was whispered in fear and legend. Varrax's claws tapped against the obsidian table. The War Council sat around him, their expressions tense. Some of his admirals shifted nervously. Others looked at him, waiting for orders. Finally, the silence was broken. "We attack." Varrax exhaled and stood up. "I will not surrender," he growled, his voice hard as iron. His golden robes flowed behind him as he stepped toward the strategy console. The room stirred. Some of his generals nodded in approval. Others, however, exchanged worried glances. "Humans are clever," Varrax admitted. "They are dangerous, but they are not invincible." He slammed a clawed fist onto the table. "We will remind them who rules this galaxy." His admirals and generals nodded in unison, their scales dark with determination. But at the far end of the table, General Orvek, the veteran strategist, remained silent. Varrax turned his sharp gaze toward him. "You disapprove, Orvek?" The crimson-scaled general hesitated. Then he spoke. "Chancellor, if we make the wrong move here," his voice was measured, calm, "we might not have an empire left." Varrax bared his fangs in frustration. "You cower before them." Orvek shook his head. "No, Chancellor. I fear them." Varrax stepped closer, his tail flicking behind him. "You disgrace our empire with your cowardice." The general didn't flinch. He simply turned his eyes toward the strategy screen. "We are facing an enemy that has already destroyed 2 of our strongest outposts, without being seen, without leaving a trace." He leaned forward. "They are here, right now, at our borders, and we do not even know how they got past our defenses." The chamber fell silent again. Deep down, even the most arrogant admirals knew Orvek was right. The Zypharian Empire had never fought an enemy like this before. The battle begins. Before anyone could speak, an alarm blared through the chamber. A panicked officer rushed inside, his face pale. "Chancellor, the human fleet has begun moving." The war table flickered, displaying a holographic projection of Zypharian space. The human ships, dark, sleek, silent, began sliding forward like shadows. Varrax's eyes narrowed. "Deploy the fleet." His voice was cold, sharp. "Crush them." The Zypharian Armada, the largest military force in the galaxy, began to mobilize. Hundreds of warships launched from hidden defense stations. Colossal battleships, their hulls glowing with blue energy, moved into attack formations. The human fleet was outnumbered 10-1. But Evelyn hadn't moved her ships in a battle formation. She had simply let them glide forward, like predators in the dark. The silent strike. The Zypharian war fleet locked onto targets. Their guns charge. Their targeting systems calculated precise firing solutions. Then, nothing. Varrax blinked. His fleet was fully armed, fully operational. But their weapons weren't firing. Across the Zypharian Armada, captains screamed in confusion. "Our weapons are offline. Power readings are dropping. Our targeting systems." Then a single ship, a massive Zypharian dreadnought, exploded. Not from enemy fire. Not from a missile or a laser strike. It imploded, like something had reached inside it and crushed it from within. Varrax stared in horror. "Wait is hey pping." The truth is revealed. Another ship vanished, then another. The human fleet never fired a shot. They were not engaging in battle. They were simply watching. Varrax's eyes widened in realization. "They're not attacking us." His voice dropped into a whisper. "They've already won." And then, Evelyn's voice echoed through every ship, every station, every screen in the Zypharian Empire. "Your fleet belongs to us now." The fall of an empire. The chamber erupted into chaos. Admirals screamed at their officers. Generals barked orders. But it was already over. The humans had infiltrated their systems before the war even began. Every Zypharian warship, every defense station, every orbital cannon, every planetary shield was under human control. Evelyn Drake's calm, measured voice came through once more. "You never understood, Chancellor," she said softly. You thought strength was in numbers. You thought war was about ships and guns. You never realized that humanity never fights wars on the battlefield. Varax sank into his throne, his mind racing. This was how they did it. This was how the Krallis Dominion disappeared overnight. This was how the Xiron Empire was erased from history. The humans never conquered their enemies. They simply erased them from existence. Evelyn's voice carried the final blow. You have one last choice, Chancellor. Her words were cold as death. Surrender, or let history forget that the Xipherian Empire ever existed. And for the first time in his life, Chancellor Varax was afraid. Fear spreads. A throne of defeat. Chancellor Varax sat in his grand war chamber, his claws clenched so tightly that deep cracks formed in the obsidian table beneath them. The room, once filled with Xipherian pride and arrogance, now felt cold, suffocating, and heavy with fear. The unthinkable had happened. The Xipherian Armada, the mightiest fleet in the galaxy, had been silenced without a single shot fired. The ships still floated in space, their weapons useless, their shields offline, but not because of any attack. Because of Evelyn Drake. Her calm voice still echoed through the chamber, though the transmission had already ended. Your fleet belongs to us now. Varax's golden eyes flickered toward his admirals and generals. Some of them sat frozen in their seats, unable to process what had happened. Others whispered to each other, their faces tight with fear. One of his advisors, strategist Krallis, spoke first. Chancellor, I do not understand. His voice trembled. How? How did they? They've been inside our systems for years, General Orvek interrupted, his crimson scales darkened with realization. The war chamber turned toward him. Orvek exhaled, his voice low, almost reverent. The humans, they never needed to attack us. He tapped the holographic display, pulling up old fleet records, years-old data. They weren't just spying on us. They were rewriting our technology from the inside. The projection zoomed in on the Xipherian defense network, a single string of code, inserted 5 years ago. The humans had already won the war before it even started. The panic begins. The realization spread through the chamber like a sickness. Some of the younger officers stood up in fear. Others sat, paralyzed, struggling to breathe. They'd been waiting, one muttered. Watching. They knew every ship we built, another said. Every system update, every movement of our fleets. They controlled us, someone whispered, and we never saw it. Varax slammed his fist against the table, his tail whipping the floor in frustration. Enough, his voice boomed, shaking the chamber. The murmurs stopped. His eyes burned with rage, but underneath, a seed of doubt had taken root. He was a warrior, a conqueror, a leader who had crushed civilizations beneath his heel. But now, he was the one being crushed. He took a slow breath. His claws flexed. His mind raced. Evelyn Drake had left him with one final choice. Surrender or vanish from history. Varax's gaze swept the room. His generals, his admirals, his advisors. They all looked at him, waiting for an answer. For the first time in his life, he had none. The betrayal. Before Varax could speak, the doors to the war chamber burst open. A Xipherian commander, his armor torn, his breath ragged, stumbled in, his face dripped with sweat, his eyes wide with terror. "See, Chancellor," he gasped. Varax growled. "What is it?" The commander struggled to find words. His hands trembled. Then he finally spoke. The Grand Marshals of the Xipherian Armada. His throat tightened. They just sent a transmission to the Terran Union. A deadly silence spread through the chamber. Varax's blood ran cold. He took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "What did they say?" The commander's breath hitched. They offered to defect. The chamber erupted in chaos. The Empire breaks apart. Betrayal. The Grand Marshals, The highest-ranking Zypharian commanders had sworn their loyalty to humanity. Panic spread through the council. Some pounded the table in rage. Others stared at each other in disbelief. Varrax's vision blurred with fury. My own officers, my own generals, have turned their backs on me. His claws raked across the table, carving deep gouges into the stone. He looked to General Orvek, the only one who had predicted this. Orvek met his gaze but said nothing. Because what else was there to say? The Zypharian Empire was collapsing. From the inside, Evelyn's final move. Another transmission flickered on, and there she was, Evelyn Drake. Calm, cold, unstoppable. Her silver hair gleamed under the dim lights of her war room. Her blue eyes carried the weight of 1,000 battles won. Her voice was steady. Chancellor Varrax, she began. Your officers have made their choice. She paused, letting the words sink in. Then she continued. The only question is, will you? Varrax gritted his teeth. He could feel it, the end of his empire, looming like a shadow over his throne. If he fought, he would lose everything. If he surrendered, he would become a ghost of history. Evelyn's voice turned soft, almost pitying. I know this is difficult, she said. The great Zypharian Empire, brought to its knees. She leaned forward. But if you do not choose now, I will make the choice for you. Varrax's claws twitched. He had one last chance, one final decision. The weight of his entire civilization rested on his next words. Would he surrender? Or would he let his empire die? He opened his mouth and spoke. The final warning. A throne of dust. Chancellor Varrax had been many things in his life. A warrior, a conqueror, the ruler of the Zypharian Empire. But now he was something else. A man on the edge of extinction. He sat in his grand war chamber, but it no longer felt grand. The walls that once held banners of victory now seemed suffocating. The glowing war maps flickered, casting long shadows over the assembled Zypharian officers, what remained of them. Many had already fled. Some had defected to humanity. And the rest. The rest were waiting, watching their leader, waiting for him to say something, anything. But what was there left to say? He had spent his entire life believing in the supremacy of the Zypharian Empire, believing in its invincibility. And now, in a single day, a single move, it had all crumbled. Evelyn Drake had shattered everything. And now she was waiting for his answer. Her face remained on the holographic transmission, her expression unreadable. She had given him one final choice. Surrender or vanish. His claws curled against the stone table. The room was silent. Everyone was waiting. Varrax closed his 4 reptilian eyes, inhaling deeply. The weight of his entire species, his empire, his history bore down on his chest. He could feel it slipping away. Then he spoke. A single word. A word that had never been uttered by any Zypharian leader before him. Surrender. A whisper. A crack in the foundation of a dying empire. But it was enough. Evelyn's verdict. Evelyn Drake did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply nodded. Wise, she said. The transmission remained open, but she did not end it. Instead, she studied him with those cold, human eyes. It was the look of a predator who had already won. Chancellor Varrax, she said slowly, her voice controlled. Patient. There is one last matter to discuss. Varrax tensed. Of course, it wasn't over. She wasn't just here to win the war. She was here to decide the fate of an empire. His claws tapped against the stone table, a slow, rhythmic beat. And what is that matter? Evelyn leaned forward, her gaze like steel. Justice. A heavy silence filled the chamber. Varrax's tail flicked behind him, his instincts screaming danger. Evelyn continued. Your empire has spent the last 2 centuries enslaving weaker species, wiping out entire civilizations, committing atrocities in the name of expansion. She exhaled, tapping the data pad on her desk. "I have records of over 300 war crimes committed under your rule." She let the words sink in. "You don't just get to surrender and walk away." Varrax felt a deep, growing dread claw its way up his spine. He had been prepared to lose. He had not been prepared to be judged. The betrayer's deal. Before Varrax could respond, another voice spoke. A Zephyrian officer, one of the traitors who had sent a transmission to the humans earlier, stepped forward. He was younger, leaner, his golden eyes filled with cold calculation. "Ambassador Drake," the officer said smoothly, ignoring the sharp glare from Varrax. "If I may speak freely," Evelyn gestured. "Go ahead." The officer straightened. "There are many within the Zephyrian military who wish for peace. We do not support the past mistakes of our empire." Mistakes. Varrax's tail twitched in fury. The cowards. They were already selling out their own people. The officer continued, his voice calm, polished. "If you spare the empire, if you spare those who choose to side with the Terran Union, we will help you bring Varrax and his war council to justice." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. Then she smiled. Varrax felt ice crawl up his spine. The trial of a tyrant. 3 hours later, the Zephyrian war chamber was abandoned. Varrax was no longer chancellor. He had been removed by his own people. He stood in the center of a massive Terran warship, his arms bound in magnetic cuffs. Around him, human soldiers stood at attention, their weapons ready. A screen hovered in front of him. The galaxy was watching. Hundreds of alien species, asterisk, some former slaves, some former enemies, asterisk, had gathered to witness the trial. Evelyn Drake stood before him, her hands clasped behind her back. "Varrax of Zyphar," she said, her voice echoing across the chamber. "You are charged with war crimes, genocide, and the attempted conquest of free civilizations." Varrax lifted his chin. His pride still fought against the weight of defeat. "And what punishment does the Terran Union offer?" he asked. His voice was sharp, defiant. Evelyn's eyes never wavered. "That is up to the galaxy to decide." She turned, facing the massive holoscreens where hundreds of alien species watched. A vote began. And one by one, the responses poured in. The verdict. It didn't take long. The decision was unanimous. Varrax closed his eyes. He had always thought that if he died, it would be on a battlefield, sword in hand, his enemies at his feet. But this was humiliation. Evelyn turned back to him. "The sentence is exile," she said. "You will spend the rest of your life in an uncharted system, far from civilization." She leaned in. "History will forget you." The final blow. Not death. Not torture. Oblivion. Varrax felt his strength leave him. His empire was gone. His legacy erased. His name forgotten. As he was led away, Evelyn turned to the galactic audience watching from their screens. She spoke calmly, clearly. "The war is over." She let the words sink in. There will never be another Zephyrian empire. And with that, the era of war ended. And the age of humanity began. The legend lives on. The fall of an empire. It was over. The Zephyrian Empire, once the greatest power in the galaxy, had crumbled. Their fleets had been silenced without a single human shot fired. Their leaders had betrayed each other to save themselves. And their once proud chancellor, Varrax, had been sent into exile, nameless and forgotten. Now, the galaxy belonged to humanity. The moment the war ended, thousands of planets celebrated. For centuries, the Zephyrians had been tyrants, conquerors, slavers. Their fall was not just a victory for the Terran Union. It was a victory for every species that had suffered under their rule. But while the galaxy cheered, one figure stood alone, watching it all unfold. Evelyn Drake. The woman who had ended an empire without a single battle. The woman whose name had once been spoken only in fear and in whispers. And now her name would be spoken in history books forever. But for her, there was no celebration. There was only one final mission left: the hidden war. The galaxy believed that the war was over, that peace had been restored. But Evelyn knew the truth. This was only the beginning. As she stood inside the Terran Union's secret command center, deep in the core of the human homeworld, a holographic map flickered before her. It did not show the Zypharian Empire, because the Zypharians were finished. It showed something worse, something far older, something that had always been watching. Her sharp blue eyes scanned the uncharted sectors of space, the places where no fleets had dared to go. And there, in the coldest, darkest part of the galaxy, something was moving. They noticed us. A voice broke the silence. It was Director Lucian Rowe, the head of Terran intelligence. He was a cold man, sharp and efficient, a shadow, just like Evelyn. He pointed at the holographic map, where a series of strange energy readings pulsed in deep space. "We picked this up just after the Zypharian Empire collapsed," he said. Evelyn's lips tightened. They finally noticed us. Lucian nodded. "We always knew they would. The true enemy." For centuries, humanity had been focused on surviving. First, they had fought for a place among the stars. Then they had removed every enemy that stood in their way. And now, at last, they were the dominant force in the galaxy. But there was one thing they had never done. They had never looked beyond the galactic rim, because there were things out there that were never meant to be found. Lucian pressed a button on the console. The holographic display zoomed in on the deep space readings. It was not a fleet. It was not a civilization. It was something far worse. A structure, ancient and vast, bigger than a planet, pulsing with unknown energy. And it was awakening. Evelyn's hands tightened behind her back. "Do we have any idea what it is?" she asked. Lucian exhaled. "No." Evelyn turned to him. "Then we need to find out." Quietly. Lucian's eyes flickered. "You want to send a scout team?" Evelyn shook her head. "No, I'm going myself." Lucian hesitated. "Evelyn, you're the most valuable human asset we have." She cut him off with a single sharp look. "I ended an empire without firing a shot," she said. "I think I can handle this." Lucian sighed. He knew arguing was useless. Instead, he simply asked, "When do you leave?" Evelyn turned back to the hologram, staring at the darkness beyond the galaxy's edge. Her voice was quiet. "Right now." The last transmission. 3 days later, Evelyn Drake's ship vanished into uncharted space. No transmissions, no records, no signs of battle. She was simply gone. And across the galaxy, rumors began to spread. Some said she had retired, disappearing into the shadows. Some said she had gone to hunt a new enemy, one greater than any before. And some whispered that she had never been human at all. The truth, no one knew. But one thing was certain. Wherever she was watching. And if the galaxy ever forgot the name Evelyn Drake, she would remind them.